Class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing Game 54 of the regular season between the San Jose Sharks and the Columbus Blue Jackets, in which the Sharks have lost 4-3. But before we jump into this game, let us do a bit of an update on the Tankathon standings. With this regulation loss for the San Jose Sharks to the Columbus Blue Jackets, they find themselves standing pat in the standings at 35 points, 31st in the league, one spot away from the coveted last place spot that they had previously held for a very long period of time, but now has been taken away from them by the Chicago Blackhawks. The good news, however, is that the Blackhawks were actually victorious earlier today over the Ottawa Senators, and this isn't just a once-in-a-blue-moon type of victory for Chicago. That is because of the very recent return of rookie phenom Connor Bedard to their lineup, and he was a big reason for why they managed to win tonight's game against Ottawa, and is likely to be a big part of future wins for this team as that season rolls on for them. So if the Sharks see some sort of downturn in performance, the Blackhawks should be winning more games than at least they have been winning as of late, just because Bedard will likely single-handedly carry them to multiple different victories. It's very possible for the Sharks to get that last place spot back for themselves and give them the best possible shot in the draft lottery at the end of this season. But let's return back to how this game went here against Columbus, and it was not the cleanest game for either of these two teams for sure. It's not that much of a surprise considering the Sharks, as I mentioned, were the 31st place team. Meanwhile, the Blue Jackets are really not that much better at 42 points in the standings coming into tonight's game. So perhaps it was expected to not exactly be the highest level of hockey played, and that indeed ended up being the case. In the first period, it felt as though it was just a completely open season for both of these teams, although primarily the Columbus Blue Jackets at times, as they traded chances. In particular, I think the best sort of way to show that off was on a particular 4-on-4 situation that occurred in the first period. Johnny Gaudreau ended up with a breakaway, and then about 15 seconds later, a second breakaway. And then once that 4-on-4 expired a couple of minutes later, he got a third breakaway, all within one period. It is rare for a player to get even a singular breakaway in a particular game, and so for Gaudreau to get three of them in one game, in one period, just goes to show how sloppy the Sharks were at times, and yet Gaudreau did not even manage to score on any of those three attempts. It was actually Duclair on his own breakaway in the first period who would get the first goal of the game and the first goal for the San Jose Sharks. However, the Blue Jackets would tie it up and then pretty quickly take the lead for themselves, and that would be the score at the end of the first period, 2-1. In the second period, the Blue Jackets would expand on their lead to make it 3-1, and it looked like that the game might just be put away for San Jose, as they were, as I said, not playing very well at all here tonight, especially in comparison to how they ended the other night against the Calgary Flames. And yet the Sharks fought their way back, even if it took a couple of lucky bounces here or there. Duclair cut the lead in half to 3-2, and then on a power play, a relatively rare power play goal for the San Jose Sharks, an actually quite nice passing play occurred to allow Zetterlund to get the game-tying goal, and that was the score that we would head into the third period with, all tied up at 3. And we were moving through the majority of this third period with no goals scored either way, and it felt as though we were destined for some overtime play, which would have given the Sharks at the very least 1 point in the standings, something that is probably not very good for them, and yet, with 13 seconds remaining on the clock, it is Boone Jenner who scores the game winner, sneaks one through Kähkönen just off of some pretty bad defensive backcheck from multiple Sharks players, and as such, the Blue Jackets win it in regulation, leaving the Sharks with 0 points in the standings. Moving on to the players to talk about, we have the top line of Duclair, Granlund, and Zetterlund. The Sharks scored 3 goals here tonight. All 3 of those goals came from this first line. Technically, the Zetterlund one was on the power play, so not really the first line, but at least all 3 of these players were the only ones to actually score here. And Duclair, I mentioned in the previous game against the Calgary Flames, was not a very good show of things if he was hoping to try and get moved at the deadline, and I wonder if there was actually a reminder to him of that very fact, that if he actually wants to get off this team and have an opportunity to perhaps make a playoff push or even play in the playoffs with a very good team, that he actually has to do well with San Jose. And so he puts up 2 goals here tonight, and they are the very prototypical Anthony Duclair goals. This is not from hard work in the offensive zone where he cycles it very well and goes to the net and gets a garbage type of goal. Nope, this is Duclair finding the open ice, using his speed, taking advantage of misplays from the opposing team, finds the breakaway opportunity there to get that first goal. Another very clean opportunity as well, relatively wide open for the second goal there too. And so it's nice to see Duclair contributing in that ways. Any team watching him right now can clearly see his skill and his skating ability on full display. The, actual hard-working, grinding type of play is not exactly there, but as I mentioned in my trade deadline preview video, Duclair does have a history of doing rather well in the playoffs. Just last year with the Florida Panthers, he managed to put up a decent amount of points in their run to the Stanley Cup Finals, and you're not going to be able to do that just playing breakaway type of goals. You actually are going to have to work hard, so perhaps it's not an opportunity to do that on the San Jose Sharks, but he will likely be able to do that for any team that does pick him up. When it comes to the rest of this first line, kind of similar to what Duclair had. Duclair benefited off of these couple of misplays from Columbus. From a general forechecking point of view, I do still think this was a pretty good line for San Jose. Actually had some decent offensive zone time. Zetterlund, not too bad. Granlund, not too bad. But it wasn't anything dominant either, which is not that much of a surprise as the Sharks were not really a better team than the Blue Jackets here tonight. When it comes to the second line, we have again Eklund, Barabanov, and Kunin. And I mentioned how this second line got better as last game rolled on against the Calgary Flames. They did not start well, but by the time the third period came along, these three players were looking pretty decent, in particular William Eklund and Luke Kunin. Barabanov to a slightly lesser extent, but still not too bad. Here tonight, definitely a bit of a different story for sure. When it comes to Barabanov, there really wasn't much doing from him at all here tonight. The same would have to be said about Luke Kunin. Eklund, it was kind of an up and down game. He did have some very solid offensive chances, but one thing that I do have to be critical of Eklund is something that has not really been the case over these last few games. I have very much complimented Eklund for really rising to pretty much any situation that he has been put in. He was inserted on the penalty kill recently after, finally getting that opportunity to do so, even though he proved himself back in the preseason, and he's done wonders for the Sharks penalty kill that has yet to let in a goal in that situation in 5-6 games now in a row, something along those lines. And he's been responding, whether he's put into the second line role, a third line role, a centerman role, a winger role, all of these things. But having said all that, here tonight, the defensive play definitely left a lot to be desired. Eklund found himself lost multiple times in the defensive zone, just not being able to keep the proper coverage on his man, maybe having some issues with the whole centerman position for the first time in the few games that he has been played in this particular role. So that was definitely a bit of an issue here for him tonight. While there were some upside offensively, I wouldn't say it was that great of a night for him. When it comes to the third line, we have Sturm being joined by Zadina, who gets promoted after his 4-point night the other day against the Calgary Flames, and Kevin Labanc, who returns to the lineup for the first time in a very, very long while, perhaps as a sort of show-off type of performance if any team is looking to potentially pick him up at the trade deadline in a couple of weeks. I would very much doubt it, as Labanc has shown very little thus far this season, but maybe there is a team desperate enough for some sort of offensive help, and the market is so dry and barren that there's literally no other choices, that Kevin Labanc could indeed end up getting moved. And so this was an opportunity to show off what he can do. I know he does want to absolutely leave San Jose at this point. There's no reason to stay with the Sharks considering they do not give him the time of day at all. And well, Labanc didn't really show much of anything. There was a very nice pass extremely early on into the game to Filip Zadina that got an opportunity there on the one-timer that was very close to actually going in if Zadina actually placed a slightly better shot. But besides that and onwards, Labanc, there was some decent work in the offensive zone, but nothing to really write home about. If this was supposed to be the game that cements himself a spot in the lineup at the very least until the trade deadline where he's hoping to get moved, he did not do that at all. So if LeBanc steps out of the lineup in the next couple of days when the Sharks go up against Vegas on Monday, I honestly wouldn't be all that surprised. I don't think he necessarily played himself out of the lineup because it wasn't a bad game. It's just pretty unremarkable, which was surprising considering you would think this would be like one of the most important games for Kevin LeBanc recently, at least in his career. When it comes to the other two players on this line, Zadina seems to be a very confidence-driven type of player. You saw back in the early parts of last game against Calgary, he wasn't necessarily rolling super hard, wasn't necessarily doing a ton of great things, but he picked up a couple of assists which seemed to give him that confidence to really play exceptionally well in the third period and was one of the Sharks' better forwards in that third period. And when it came to the start of this game against Columbus, he also was playing exceptionally well. I already mentioned the one-timer that was set up by Kevin LeBanc that he came very, very close on scoring. Then a couple of minutes later, he had also a very good chance, but it seems as though since those chances weren't really working, Zadina kind of fell off as the game wore on, and he just wasn't super effective as we moved, into the second and into the third periods. There was a very nice defensive play where he managed to tie up the stick of a Columbus player who would have had a really, really great chance to score, but otherwise relatively unremarkable once we got past that early part where he seemed to still be carrying over the momentum from the Calgary Flames game. And then when it comes to Nico Sturm, really not much special to mention there. And then we get to the fourth line. The fourth line was obviously outstanding for San Jose in the previous game, representing Zadina's 4 points, Justin Bailey's 3 points. Here tonight, bit of the change as Zadina was bumped up to the third, so it was Hoffman who moved down to the fourth line. Now, Hoffman, I mentioned, was pretty invisible for the Sharks in the previous game. He was probably their least effective forward against Calgary. Here tonight, though, while I'm not going to go completely the other way and say Hoffman was outstanding, I actually thought Hoffman played a pretty solid game. A couple of slick moves in the offensive zone, which is just something that when Hoffman is on, he actually is one of the more skilled players on the San Jose Sharks roster currently. When it comes to actually handling the puck, he does some pretty nice things. It's just that it is in nowhere anyway consistent. Like for Mike Hoffman, he'll go like 5 games in a row of doing nothing and then suddenly show up and make like a couple of slick plays. You'll be like, wow, if Hoffman could play like that, maybe he should be on the first line. And then David Quinn will place him in the top 6 role, and then it just will not carry forward anymore. So it's definitely a bit odd to see at times, but I guess this was one of the on games for Mike Hoffman. When it comes to the other two players here, I will say I actually thought Carpenter, compared to the previous game where he was massively overshadowed by both Bailey and Zadina, pretty much carrying the offensive load of that fourth line, I actually thought Carpenter looked pretty good here tonight, and Bailey, not living up to the 3 points previously, doesn't now put up 3 points for the rest of the season, but, it was not a bad game either. Then we move on to the defensive side of things, and this was the pairings that they came in last game with, now going into this game: Ferraro, Ruda, Vlasic, Emberson, Addison, Okhotyuk. But as the game rolled on, David Quinn started to actually juggle these defensive pairings, and this is primarily because of the aforementioned earlier parts in the video, the sloppiness that the San Jose Sharks had, and a big part of that was their defensive pairings just not seeming to be in sync with each other, which was strange because these players had been playing with each other a lot rather recently. And so Ferraro and Ruda ended up becoming Ferraro and Emberson. Addison and Okhotyuk ended up becoming Okhotyuk and Ruda, and then Vlasic and Emberson ended up becoming Vlasic and Addison. And in the third period, it was mostly Ferraro and Emberson, and then Ruda and Okhotyuk getting most of the shifts, and Vlasic and Addison were actually used rather sparingly, at least from what I saw. Now, when it comes specifically to how these defensemen did perform here tonight, a couple who stood out in a pretty bad way. Jan Ruda had some issues. I liked him jumping up in the play offensively multiple different times. Actually had a couple of really good pinches in the offensive zone, but defensively, like I mentioned in the previous game against Calgary, where he was just playing a bit too aggressively and got caught in wrong positions, that carried into this game against Columbus, and that was a big reason for why it felt very, very sloppy on the night. So he ended up getting bumped down, I guess, so to speak, with Okhotyuk, who on the other hand was actually one of the better defensemen for the San Jose Sharks. Now, I mentioned in the previous game that I was surprised that Addison and Burroughs continued to get a second game in a row, and I kind of speculated that Okhotyuk maybe was injured, and that's why he wasn't jumping into the lineup in favor of either of those two players. I don't know if that's still the case, but he ends up playing here tonight and looked pretty decent, at least I would say. Also from an offensive perspective, getting some shots on net, actually making himself quite available for his forwards, which was relatively nice to see. When it comes to Calen Addison as well, he looked decent enough. A very nice pass on the Zetterlund goal, which was on the power play, which is probably like the first time we've actually seen like a bit of quarterback power play expertise from Addison in all the time he's been in this role for the San Jose Sharks since being acquired from the Minnesota Wild. He also picked up a secondary assist on the Duclair goal, so him putting up 2 assists, not too bad, I guess. Marc-Edouard Vlasic, who had strung together like 10, 12 really good games, finally has fallen off at least slightly. I was not a huge fan of Vlasic's performance here tonight, and while it definitely didn't go back to what he was back in the early parts of the season where he was genuinely awful, I do think Vlasic tonight, not his best performance of the last like month or so. And then when it comes to Ferraro as well, while I don't think he was as bad or as awkward as his partner Jan Ruda, I do think this was a bit of a weaker game for Ferraro for sure. And then we get to the goaltender Kaapo Kähkönen. He was outstanding a few nights ago against the Winnipeg Jets. Here tonight though, definitely left a bit to be desired. A couple of these goals he didn't have too much of a chance on, but you take a look at the Blue Jackets' second goal that made it 2-1. That's a save he definitely could have made it. And of course, for sure, the Boone Jenner one that beats him 5-hole, a save that he could have and definitely very much needed to make to keep the Sharks alive and force that overtime. But because he lets it in, the Sharks do end up losing in regulation. And while that may be a good thing in the tankathons type of situation, I'm sure from a Sharks perspective, the players and coaches not super happy that goal ends up getting let in. It is definitely fault of the defenseman and the forward not coming back in that situation, but also Kähkönen, you do need that save. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Monday. They'll be taking on the Vegas Golden Knights, so they'll be going up against a team that is near the top of the standings compared to the Blue Jackets, who are near the bottom. So we should expect definitely a much higher level of opponent. We'll see if the Sharks can rise to the occasion. Class dismissed.